Welcome back to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel, and in this episode, I have a really fun conversation with Ian Keough about the incredible origin story of Dynamo. If you weren't aware, Ian is the original creator of Dynamo. He's also widely known as the father of Dynamo, and today he takes us on a journey through its evolution from a simple idea to becoming an essential tool in computational design. What began as a project to bridge the gap between Revit and visual programming grew into something much bigger. In this conversation, Ian shares stories about Dynamo's development, including the challenges of transitioning from an independent project to becoming part of Autodesk, the technical hurdles they faced, and how the community played a crucial role in its success. We also discuss how Dynamo has transformed careers, created a new class of computational designers, and helped countless architects and designers learn programming. It's a story of innovation, perseverance, and the unexpected impact one tool can have on an entire industry. Before we jump in, I have a bit of housekeeping to cover regarding the current state of social media's algorithmic feeds and so-called followers on these platforms. For those of you not already subscribed to the Troxel Podcast itself or to my email newsletter, I rely heavily on LinkedIn's platform and therefore their algorithm to share episodes and attract new listeners. It's still the best social media platform for me to post on and try to connect with people who haven't yet heard of the show. But there's a startling fact about social media and a creator's ability to connect with an audience. It's being referred to right now in the media sphere as the death of the follower, because only 1 to 5% of people who have actually opted into quote unquote following me on social media platforms even see my posts. And the crazy thing is that the bigger the company and the number of followers, the smaller engagement gets. The current average is 3.8%. So in other words, for every 1,000 followers I have, only about 38 see my posts. So why is this? You see, social media is now being optimized for discovery, which means they are putting short-form new content like shorts or reels, for example, in front of their users on their platform instead of the content from creators they've explicitly followed. And of course, this is all being driven by the need for them to place ads into their feed, which is their main business model. The goal is to keep you scrolling and therefore seeing more ads. So posts like mine that include a link off of their platform don't play well with their goals. So if you weren't aware of this, now you know. So why am I talking about this? Because I would love it if we could just skip the algorithm entirely. How? There's two ways. First, subscribe to Troxel wherever you watch or listen. And second, on my website, found at trxl.co, so that we can directly connect over email. That's it. Okay, let's get on with the episode at hand. I had a great time talking with Ian, and as usual, there's an extensive amount of additional information in the show notes, so be sure to check them out. You can find them in your podcast app if you're a paid member, and if you're a free member, you can find them on the website, which is once again trxl.co. All right, we have arrived. It's time to crack open your favorite beverage, find a comfortable seat around the campfire, settle in, and enjoy listening to Ian Keough tell the Dynamo story. Welcome back, Ian. You were just on the podcast to talk about the latest and greatest stuff with Hypar, right? And do you have an official name for that? Like this new version? I don't know.
Hypar number 2. We've been referring to it as version 2.0, which okay. I suppose we need something internally. Maybe this is too much inside baseball, but internally we call it Pringle because the shape of a Pringle chip is a hyperbolic paraboloid, right, which is where Hypar comes from. But externally, we just refer to it as Hypar 2.0.
It sounds like a great prompt for some AI video thing where it's like, I want to see me opening a can of Pringles, and the idea forms right there that's what we're going to base our startup off of this.
And then you eat the entire can as one does in one sitting with a can of Pringles, and you feel bad about yourself for the rest of the day.
As one does, yes. All right, so you were recently on the show talking about Hypar 2.0. And today I want to talk about the story of Dynamo because that came before Hypar, and this is really, I think, one of your first marks that you made in the universe of AEC software for sure, right?
Yes. I think that's probably safe to say. I'm trying to think if there was anything before Dynamo that was like of note. No, there was not. That was kind of like the first thing.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. Let's talk about where this came from. I mean, and maybe you want to go even back like right before it started. Where were you and what were you working on that kind of led into that project?
I might get this history a little bit wrong. I'm going to try to be very careful here. I was working at Bureau Happold Consulting Engineers in New York City. So I actually have a master's in architecture, but I saw some presentations by Greg Otto about Bureau Happold stuff, and I was like, I want to go work there. And so I like knocked on his door and went to work at Bureau Happold like right out of graduate school because they were doing all this like crazy, cool, complicated buildings. And that's actually an important part of the Dynamo story because like Bureau Happold didn't hire a lot of architects at the time. And when they hired me, the way the story goes is that Craig Schwitter, who was in charge of the New York office, told Greg Otto, like, we don't hire architects. Why are you hiring this guy? And he's like, if you can't figure out what to do with this guy, you have to fire him. So Greg just loaded everything on me. I was doing models in Rhino and renderings for people and like Adobe Illustrator, like layouts for project presentations. I was just kind of doing everything. And one of the things that Bureau Happold needed, because it worked on these like super complicated projects, was they needed a lot of help like getting data from one piece of software to another piece of software. They'd have like an analysis software where they were doing, crazy load cases on these shell structures that they were building and these complex geometry and stuff, and they would have to transfer that stuff after they did that analysis over to some other application, and then they needed to take some geometry and transfer it to another application. So I actually started writing code, just kind of like teaching myself to write code as a way of like helping to do that. So fast forward a few years, I'm like in Bureau Happold in the New York office, and now the Revit API, oh man, I'm trying to remember how this worked. The Revit API is like well established at this point. We had started banging on the Revit API when it first came out. Like I was making Revit API stuff and sending it to this guy named Wade Chu, who was like the head of the implementation of the API at Autodesk at the time for these crazy Bureau Happold like structures. And he was like, the Revit API is not built for this. Like, this is not going to work. And so I had this like good relationship with the people who were working on the API, and they were always looking at stuff that we were doing because it was really, really pushing the frontier of what the sort of Revit API could do. And there was a very specific problem that kind of led to the geometry library or the utility library that would go on to become Dynamo. And it was that, people who model in Revit know that if you have, we did a lot of stuff with beams, right? I was mostly seconded to the structural team at Bureau Happold. And so everything they did was like beams in space. And it was all about like these complex structures that were made up of these linear elements and like, and then some nominal geometry on which those things were based would change, and you would have to like update the whole thing. And there's this problem in Revit that like nothing at the time worked like that. There wasn't an idea of like two linear elements that you connected them together, and like when some underlying shape changed, like those linear elements would just change together. And so the first thing I did was actually make this like point object. I made a point object in this utility library, and it was like a little gumball, like with the axes and everything else. And what you could do is you could like, associate linear elements in Dynamo by IDs or something. I can't remember exactly how it worked, with a point that they would associate with. And then all you had to do was move the points, and like a marionette, it would move all the attached beams and stuff. Mm-hmm. So then I wrote a whole suite of utilities around that were all just about like moving points in space. We started to use this. We had this hilarious, like, I think it was called the Bureau Happold tool set or something. We had this like, people who remember like the ribbon, when the ribbon first came out and you made add-ins in Revit and they would like drop down, and then you could have drop downs on the drop downs, and then you could have drop downs on the drop downs. This thing was like,
you could go deep.
Top level tools that like resulted in 400 like nested drop. It was crazy. And so
engineers and you are very organized. Let's just say it that way. You want to make sure that the things are in the right place.
Yeah, it was like so bad that, it's like those things that are so nested that as they fly out, you're worried about like dragging your mouse off just a little bit because you'll lose your place.
You get to start over, right?
So that was like the interface to use all of these tools, and we were actually using them on all these projects. So like engineers would engineer they'd create a geometry, and then they'd use these tools to transfer data to analysis tools and back and forth. And it was kind of cool, but it was very clunky. And I think around this time, I remember maybe explicit history was becoming a thing, but certainly generative components had been a thing. Right. And actually the little gumball point that I made was very akin to like the points. I mean, this is like really dating me because anybody who watches this thing and remembers or listens to this thing and remembers generative components and the points and everything else, it was very akin to how you did stuff in generative components. In generative components, you wrote these scripts to like create these points, and then you connected the points with these laced sort of things. So this whole utility library for the geometry side of things was very much like generative components. And I remember I went to Smart Geometry, maybe the Smart Geometry Conference. Speaking of generative components, I think I went to the Smart Geometry Conference in New York City, and for some reason, I think I was at Cooper Union or something. So I was at Cooper Union, and I remember because I had been communicating with the Revit API team, I had met this guy, Matt Jezik, my friend Matt Jezik, who at the time was just like, he was hanging out in the forums and stuff, and he was doing this cool stuff, and I knew he was a guy who like worked at Autodesk, and I was like, oh yeah, he knows what he's doing, and he would go to these events, and I remember pulling him aside at one of these events and saying, hey Matt, I want to show you this library I'm working on, and the library was literally like, it was just like scripts for making these points and connecting things to them, and then like editing the points and having the connected stuff like update everything else.
Inside of Revit, right? And so obviously is that the connection with Matt at that point?
Yeah. So yeah, it could, because it was connected to the Revit API, but the library itself was built in a way that it didn't have to be attached to Revit. It's just like, that's where it did its thing. So, and I think even at that point, I had started calling it the Dynamo library or something, and I can't remember exactly, but so I showed this thing to him, and then I moved to LA. My wife gets a job in LA, and I move out here, and Bureau Happold had an office in Culver City, which is where I live now, and Greg Otto, who had started that office and who had hired me into New York, said, yeah, just come out. So I came out and I sat with there was this mezzanine in our office, the first Bureau Happold office in LA, which was here in Culver City. It's now downtown, but there was this kind of mezzanine where the computational design people sat. So now at this point, Bureau Happold has like a lot of architects working for it across the global practice. It has, there were probably 10 people sitting up on this little mezzanine here who were doing computational design stuff, most of them with backgrounds in architecture, or non-engineering backgrounds at least. And then across all the offices around the world, they started to have a lot of like architects because, projects were getting more and more complicated. Every project that Bureau Happold was working on was some complex geometry craziness, and architects ended up being really, really useful for working in that way. And so I had this little library, and I had the Bureau Happold tools, and I had this little other library, but we weren't really using the other little library yet. There's one other. Yeah, right. Okay, I'm remembering now. Sorry, and I'm going to remember this stuff in real time. One project that I did right before I left for LA, there was a project we were doing with Moshe Safdie's office. Moshe Safdie was working on the museum in Northwest Arkansas, for the Walton family, and I can't.
Well, I'll look it up for the show notes. I'll
yes,
look it up and
I'm forgetting
I'll
the name of I'm forgetting the name of the museum, but it had all of these. It had all of these timber roofs. These really cool, like glue laminated beams that would span like 40, 50, 60 feet. And on top of those glue laminated beams were these like adaptable plates, and the adaptable plates each had like metal tie rods coming into them, making this kind of diaphragm of a diagrid of these metal tie rods. And so you can imagine you've got these like swoopy sort of timbers. You've got little plates on top of them that are sticking off normal to the swoopy timbers. And then you've got tie rods coming in on a sort of diagrid pattern as this swoopy thing. So those adjustable plates like have all these angles and they have to like move around and stuff. And that was like the first application of that library that I had built. So what I did was I embedded, instances of these points inside a family that represented the kind of tie plate. And then I associated all the strut connectors with the points on this tie plate. So you could literally like update the underlying geometry of the whole roof, and all of these like the glue lambs would update, the tie plates would update, the struts would move, and everything would stay connected. And you wouldn't have to change any of your drawings. You wouldn't have to like, because they were, at that point, they were tweaking the geometry of this thing like all the time,
Mm-hmm.
And so people would look at that, they were like, oh, that's kind of cool. It's actually like
parametric.
It's parametric. And right, it's like fully parametric. It's not just like Revit parametric. And we had done that. One of the reasons we had done that was because they also wanted to evaluate using digital components. Digital components? The Gary product.
Digital project.
They wanted to use, I was also a CATIA guy, and I was like, well, we could do it in digital project, but I have this little software library over here that basically if we use that, we could do this without all of the like $20,000 add-ons to like digital project to make it work. And it ended up working. That's the craziest thing. I basically told them, I was like, I think we just turned like your $5,000 Revit or whatever it cost at the time, your $3,000 Revit into a $20,000 piece of software with this like one little software library, that gave it this kind of adaptability. Again, before adaptive components, before any of this stuff was like a thing. So
I want to break in right here because I want to get back to the conversation you had with Matt too. We'll pick up there, but like, where did that name come from? You said you think you were calling it the Dynamo Library at that point. So where'd that come from?
I literally plucked it out of thin air. I was like, it's dynamic. Dynamo.
It's a superhero.
Like a little engine. He's also a magician, and there's a funny story about how I sat behind him on a plane one time. But yeah, that was it. It was, and I looked around. I was like, are there other software? I mean, also remember, this is 2010. I mean, I think I was still I was working on this software library like 2008, 2009, something like that. I can't remember. So this is before there's like a zillion startups out there. I mean, I'm sure the name Dynamo is now like, some startup has already like raised $100 million, called itself Dynamo and flamed out, but like at the time, there was nothing else out there. So
where did you get this proclivity to code yourself, to do things yourself, to make your own tools?
That was literally like that mandate from the top down at Bureau Happold that like if he couldn't keep me busy, like he'd have to fire me. So I had written a little bit of at the previous firm that I had worked for way back in the days. Through graduate school, I worked at this firm called ESI Design, which is an exhibit design company that's run by Ed Schlossberg, and it was super, super fun. We did interactive museum exhibits and all this kind of crazy stuff. They were a Vectorworks shop, and I had taught myself VectorScript, which is the built-in scripting language inside Vectorworks, to help lay out stuff we were doing there. But it was, kind of scripty kind of stuff. And then through graduate school, I dabbled a little bit in MelScript on Maya.
For Maya, yeah.
But I didn't really start programming until Bureau Happold. And the joke I always tell there is, Like I tell kids who are like learning how to program today, you have no idea how well you have it. Like,
right. Light years.
endless hours of YouTube videos
Right.
and coding tutorials. And now like AI is writing code for you. Back in the day, there were books.
Right.
Like you had
And
a
if you
book.
messed up one, and you would be there scouring it, looking for where you screwed up, that one
And like,
character.
you didn't even, well, now imagine on top of that, you not only do you have these books, you got to read, like learn how to write code from a book. So I would like go down to the Barnes and Noble below Bureau Apple and sit in the aisles. I never bought the books. I was too cheap. I would just like read the coding books,
Right.
you know? And then on top of that, when the Revit API first came out, there was no way to like interactively debug anything you were making. So like you would have to throw up message boxes. Like you'd throw up a message box that says, I got here in the code, or the value.
So you knew where to look.
So you knew where to look. You knew what the values were. Or if there was, like I certainly didn't know how to do it because I wasn't a sophisticated programmer in any way. So yeah, to your question though, it was really just about, I had to keep myself busy. So I kind of like went looking around for things to, that were valuable to people that needed to be done with code. And also because the engineers couldn't do it. The engineers were like super, super smart, but none of them like knew how to do any scripting or automation or anything else. So, and all the tools that they were using had APIs. Like we were using Robot for structural analysis, and it had an API way back in the day, like a beautiful API. You could do anything with that software. Wow. And the engineers didn't really know how to use it,
Let's take a break from the conversation to tell you about Arcol, who is helping make this episode possible. Architects should demand more out of their design tools. Imagine working on a project where architects, owners, and contractors are truly in sync. No miscommunication, no back and forth chaos, just seamless collaboration. That's what Arcol makes possible. Arcol believes teams shouldn't have to waste time switching between apps and navigating endless email threads. Your tools should work for you, not the other way around. With Arcol, you can validate ideas as you iterate your designs while keeping all your documents and people aligned. No more silos, no more guesswork, just better results. Ready to upgrade your team's design workflow? Learn more at arcol.io/TRXL. That's arcol.io/TRXL. My thanks to Arcol for supporting this episode of the podcast. And now let's get back to the conversation. Talk about some of the other platforms that were out there. You mentioned generative components. Obviously, Rhino was around. There was RhinoScript. Obviously, there was AutoCAD for 2D stuff and some 3D, right? And they had their own programming language, like Lisp or whatever it was called, AutoLisp. And then there was, I remember applications like Gem. Do you remember that one? That was like a three-dimensional, it was like kind of this idea of having parametric, you would have voxels, and those voxels would basically get filled.
Was that the one that was based on AutoCAD?
I don't know what it was based.
Sorry, not AutoCAD, on Excel. There was one that you like filled in tables in Excel, and it would generate geometry but it could only do basically like facades.
I thought that was probably it. And then there was like panel tools inside of Rhino, even I think at that date, like 2009-ish. And so where did Grasshopper even come onto the scene at that point? Because
so Grasshopper's not on the scene yet. Like now the new hotness is still like generative components. Architects are also kind of playing around with Maya and MelScript, and maybe Python had come on the scene for Maya at the time, so people were still doing that. Some people were trying to automate 3D Studio Max and everything else, but that never really caught on. And so you were either scripting in Rhino, which had a pretty good scripting interface in its RhinoScript stuff, or VBA. I think you could write stuff in VBA at the time.
I think
you
were
either
on that,
using generative components, or this was when Digital Project was a thing, and Gary was like trying to get Digital Project to become a thing. So the people right out of the bleeding edge were like trying to evaluate whether or not we were all going to be working in CATIA in the future. So like I taught a CATIA class, I co-taught a CATIA class at Columbia for architects using power copies and this like crazy stuff that's been around forever on CATIA, but is extraordinarily expensive and no architect would ever buy, and also incredibly complicated to use, which is probably why Digital Project doesn't exist anymore. So that's kind of the landscape. And also like And Revit is just starting to kind of find its traction, right? Revit came out, I think Revit architecture came out in 2001. I joined Bureau Happold in 2005, and literally like day one, on my chair was a boxed copy of Revit Structure. They were like, there's this new thing, it's called Revit, we're building this cricket stadium, and you're going to build it in Revit. It's going to be the first project that Bureau Happold globally has ever done in this software called Revit. And by the way, all the drawings have to look exactly like all the drawings have looked for 20 years.
Yeah, good luck.
I was so screwed.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah, we had this like really, really ornery CAD guy who's great, Simon. He was fantastic, incredible CAD guy. But he was like just riding me about line weights and at the time, you couldn't configure this stuff in Revit to look like your drawings had always looked, and it was a lot of all-nighters.
Remember just the transition, like he worked in AutoCAD and he had, however many colors, and he was reading drawings through color, right? And then Revit comes along and it's black and white. And it was like you had this graphical representation with line weights and stuff, but you're like, it's a different language for people who are operating and who are these technicians operating these things. Like you actually learned how to decode the drawing through color because you didn't see the line weight on the screen.
And they were also so frustrated that you had to build a model of a building to get the drawing. They were just like, just move that line over. And I'm like, well, that line is a slab edge. You want me to change the shape of the slab? They were like, whatever, just move it over so that the slab edge line on the drawings is in the right place. Like there was probably, there was a transitional period there at Bureau Happold where we had a floor in New York of drafters. And the engineers would like do their work and sketch out what they wanted. Then they'd carry it down to the drafters. And that's how they'd operated forever and ever. And the drafters would do the thing. And the drafters were incredibly skilled people. But when BIM came on the scene, very few of them made the transition to somebody from Bureau Happold would probably call me out on that. But it seemed to me like we had a lot of drafters and like a small percentage of them actually made the transition to BIM because you had to learn. Many of these people just didn't know how buildings went together.
It's not starting over, but it's a huge learning curve at that point with all that muscle memory that you have built into the platform that you've been using for a long time, right? And then to say, you have to actually think about this differently. Like you said, you build the model and you extract the drawings rather than just creating the drawings and moving something and then coordinating all the drawings that affected.
And you're reminding me, when I say that Bureau Happold had now at some point by the time I got to LA hired a lot of architects, one of the reasons they had hired a lot of architects was because young architects who weren't so interested in going out and working in like proper design architecture firms and wanted to know more about how buildings go together ended up coming in droves to Bureau Happold, and they were great at BIM. They were really hungry about the new tools. They wanted to learn Revit. They wanted to learn how buildings went together, so they were really interested in building models of buildings. And that was a benefit for all the engineering firms. They started to hire architects to help make the models of their buildings. So that was a kind of an interesting dynamic. Yeah, I remember at one point in New York, I was working, all of the people who were doing BIM at that point, a lot of them had architectural backgrounds. They were going to NJIT or other schools and coming out with BIM proficiency was starting to become a thing. So that is to say, like, the landscape was still very much like, it's funny, the landscape looked oddly similar to how it is today. I think SketchUp had come out too, but like that wasn't even in our domain. I think SketchUp had come out, gotten really sort of widely used, got acquired by Google for a completely different purpose than like architectural concept, and then got spun out of Google again and got eaten up by Trimble at some point. We just weren't even tracking SketchUp because it kind of wasn't in our orbit. But I know it was out there and it was contemporary with that stuff. But yeah, landscape very similar to today. Revit, Rhino, So we do that project. We do the Motion Softy project with the cool roofs and everything else. We kind of proved that like with this automation layer on top of Revit, you could seriously upgrade Revit, And I think that got a lot of people thinking like, whoa, we can like, And we started doing, then at that point, we started doing crazy projects in Revit. We did this, a project for Morphosis, which is the Cooper Union, the new building of the Cooper Union. If you've ever been in New York City, there's a Morphosis project that has this light well that kind of goes up through the entire center of the building.
It's a beautiful stair.
It's a stair that goes up a few stories, and then it's this like cage sculpture thing, structural sculpture thing that goes up. That was all done in Revit.
That's
so
crazy.
Like people go back and look at the models and stuff we did of that, and they're like, what? But it was because we had these like points in space with all this association stuff, and like that we were able to do that. And I presented at tons of conferences and stuff about like this bleeding edge kind of stuff we were doing in Revit at the time. And that was about the time when I showed Matt this kind of library of dynamic points and lines kind of tools. And it really just did points, lines, and transforms of stuff. And it had a pretty high level API for doing that kind of stuff. So then I move out to LA, and I honestly don't know how long I was in. I think I started working on it right away, because if you look, this is 2010, I moved to LA, and some of the first tweets about Dynamo are from the very first house that I rented in Culver City. So I know for a fact that I was working on what is Dynamo now in 2010.
And Twitter was around, right? So there's another.
Twitter was around.
I think I started on Twitter in 2006, I want to say. So it'd been around for a while.
Yeah, you must have been there right at the beginning.
I was there when it was transitioning off of cell phones, literally SMS for tweets, to, like the iPhone came out in 2007, right? So
so I was like, I had a blog for some time, and I was writing little things in this blog, but then Twitter came out, and I was like, oh, cool, I can post like little updates here. So if anybody, I'm not really on Twitter anymore, but if anybody wants to, my history is still there. If you want to go back and look at the history, like very, very early on, you'll see screenshots of like very old Dynamo. Nice. So, and at the time, it was the orange nodes period, which people who have been around Dynamo for a long time know that the nodes were orange for a very long time. And this is, it must have been, explicit history was definitely out at this point, because I remember thinking like, oh, I want my nodes to look glassy and bubbly like that guy David's nodes. So there was
and explain what explicit history is real quick, just for those who don't.
Explicit history is the precursor to Grasshopper. It was what Grasshopper was called, and I don't know, maybe you'll get David Rutten on this show one of these days, and he can tell you if this is true or not. But my recollection is that explicit history was what Grasshopper was called before it was called Grasshopper. Right. So when architects were first playing with this thing, and it was very, very kind of like beta.
It was a plugin. It was a plugin for Rhino at that point. It was not bundled. They were not one and the same company. Yeah. It was just David, right? As far as I know, it was just David.
But it must have had a UI, because I remember thinking like, oh, I like the way that they do that. And but I did all kinds of like other stuff too. Like I'd never built a UI, like a software UI before. So it is just like hilariously bad. You go back and look at those like orange nodes. At one point, I surrounded I made the ports on the nodes kind of stick halfway off the node. And so they had these like, I don't know, they looked like nipples on the sides of the nodes. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. It it felt like very tactile and, kind of skeuomorphic. Like these were, at one point I made the texture behind them look like an actual workbench. And I think
this was the days of skeuomorphic design, like for sure, right?
Yes,
I mean, iPhone 2007, like remember the fine Corinthian leather in the calendar app, and there was all of those kinds of things.
Thank you for that recollection, because that is like totally in my defense. It was of the moment. It wasn't just me being.
It wasn't just you. We wanted rich textures on everything, on website backgrounds. Like finding seamless textures was like a lost art.
So I had no idea what I was doing, and I was using WPF, which is the Windows Presentation Framework. So this is going to I'm sorry, people in your audience are going to be like, oh my God, Windows, WPF. WPF is actually awesome. It's been around for a really long time. And now it's pretty great. I think they have versions of it. You can do cross-platform development, mobile devices, everything else. But at the time, it was kind of like their new interface. They had this other interface that they made for the web, which was supposed to place. This was also the time when everybody was getting rid of Flash plugins.
Yep.
Were Flash. Because Apple basically killed Flash, right?
Yep.
By saying it's not going to run on the iPhone.
Flash. Thoughts on Flash was the letter that he wrote. Yep.
Exactly right. So this is several years into that, right before the first iPad comes out. Everybody's trying to throw Flash overboard, and Microsoft had built this thing called Silverlight, which was the precursor to WPF, and it was around for a couple of years, and they were shutting that down. And WPF was the recommended way to build new UIs for Windows stuff. And so I was programming this thing in WPF, and until a couple of years into it, I had no idea how to do things correctly in WPF. If you were to go back, and by the way, all of this code, I think if you have any Cody people who listen to this thing, I'm sure you do, you can go to the GitHub repository for Dynamo right now and go back to day one, the first commit. You can probably find this original terrible WPF code that I was working
Nice.
Literally 12 years ago, 2010, 2011, whenever that was.
So did you start publishing there immediately when you started this project, or was this something you went back and kind of backfilled at some point for the GitHub
publishing
repository?
Where? Oh, on GitHub? Well, yeah. So that's the other thing. GitHub was starting at this time. So I can't remember, maybe the first beginnings of, I don't remember when GitHub started or when I started using it. I do remember that at some point I started pushing stuff to GitHub, and I had another kid. Right after I moved to LA, I had my son, and also got acquired for another piece of technology that I had bought, got acquired by this startup out of Boston, which subsequently got acquired by Autodesk. But that whole process of that getting acquired and me getting acquired with it, me going to work for that company out of Boston, and then me getting acquired by Autodesk, was a 2-year period maybe where I didn't have a lot of time to work on Dynamo. And I open sourced it. And Matt Jezik, again, was one of the first people that I told. I was like, Matt, I don't have time to work on this with this acquisition happening and everything else. So I'm going to open source it, because I thought, even back then, I thought this thing needs to exist in the kind of public domain. There was just this was, at this point, it must have been that GitHub was kind of picking up steam, and the idea of open source was picking up steam. And the thing that I had definitely seen inside Bureau Happold was that people were just doing stuff over and over and over again. And my joke about this is always the Stadium Bowl generator. Mm-hmm. Every firm that I ever worked with at Bureau Happold that did stadiums, and we worked with a lot of them. I've probably worked on 4 or 5 World Cup soccer stadiums. Every one of the firms that we worked with on that stuff had their own little script to generate, Stadium Bowl layouts. And they'd be like, hey, you want to see our special script for generating Stadium Bowl layouts? And I'm like, oh, so lame. And so I think at that time, I just started to think this is not your IP, right? This should just be out there as something that we all contribute to, and we all sort of vet that, yeah.
Because you actually know what it takes to create one of those, and you see it happening copy after copy, and they're all from scratch, right? And so you see the waste, literally.
Create, maintain, it's worth noting that 2 or so years after I got acquired by this other company and left Bureau Happold, I talked to somebody who was working in Bureau Happold, literally sitting in my old chair. And I said, oh, yeah, are you guys still using the Bureau Happold tools? He's like, oh, no. I mean, those things the installer broke at some point, and then we couldn't figure out how to years of work like
Gone.
into these tools, just basically like disappeared, and it's because software is hard. Like software is like a garden. And if you've ever gardened and you leave your garden for the littlest amount of time and the weeds start popping up, and pretty soon you've got this garden full of weeds and it just becomes like totally unmanageable. You got to like burn it down and start over again. That is software. So if any of you out there are like in the midst of writing a mean comment on a GitHub repository to an open source repo maintainer, stop what you're doing and consider for a moment that person is thanklessly like developing this thing, updating this thing, maintaining it, deploying it, making sure that it doesn't break. Like they're doing this on their nights and weekends because it's not their primary job. Like, there's a lot of like love that goes into these projects, and it takes a lot. So like these organizations are not constitutionally set up to like build software, maintain software, deploy software.
No, they're working on projects. Yeah.
They're working on projects.
Right.
So I think at that very early time, I had this thought like, okay, this stuff is just going to have to be, and it wasn't like I was making money from it or anything else. There was no market at the time for Revit add-ins or anything. And I think people had started to play with it, like, because from day one, I had started to put, I think on my blog, I started to put like installers, or maybe not even installers. It was just like a zip file full of all the files. I was like, put these in a directory somewhere in your Revit plugin. And so people had access to the code and they were actually responding to me and emailing, and they're like, wow, this is really cool. And like starting to like build the kinds of workflows. And at the time it had a very limited set of things that it could do. It could do all the things that little library could do before. Very simple geometry stuff because I didn't have a proper geometry kernel. And then I think I started latching into more geometry functionality inside Revit. So it was kind of using Revit's geometry kernel in the same way that Explicit History was using Rhino's geometry kernel. Mm-hmm. And Revit's geometry kernel still wasn't great. It wasn't doing crazy NURBSy kind of stuff. It was still like, comics and, but it was good enough. And so that's where it was at the time. It was like orange nodes on Twitter and everything else. And then I open source this thing and I tell Matt, and he's like, that's actually pretty cool because we have this summer intern. Autodesk has this great summer internship program where they bring people in from the universities and stuff to work for the summer. And they had this guy, Stephen Elliott, I think Stephen went to Northeastern. And I think Stephen still works for Google. But he, at the time he was a student and he came in and Matt said, we've got this guy, Stephen. We're really interested in contributing to the Dynamo project. Could I have him take a look? And Stephen starts in the summer, looks at the mess of things that I had built. And
this is during the time when you basically were saying you had to pause from this because you were doing this other 2-year-long acquisition.
Yeah. And by the way, this was never my job. Like doing this was like a nights and weekends kind of thing. And so now I have a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old and a baby and a full-time job at Bureau Happold, which was in and of itself like pretty hard. And so they have this guy, Stephen Elliott, start to contribute to this thing. Now, this is where I'm going to get the times like all messed up because I can't remember the exact sequence. Before I left, I will say this much about like how this started to land in Bureau Happold on projects. Before I left Bureau Happold, there was a project that we were working on with HOK. It was called ARTIC, ARTIC, the Anaheim Regional Transport Intermodal Center.
Well, I used to live in Southern California. I know exactly the building you're talking about.
It's got the big ETFE roof. Right. And so Greg Otto, the HOK's office used to be right across the street from us. He literally marched over to HOK and stole the facade package from Thornton Tomasetti. I'm going to get I might get in trouble for saying this, but I think Thornton Tomasetti, they weren't happy with Thornton Tomasetti's work for whatever reason. Greg was like, we're right across the street. We should absolutely have this project. It was ETFE. It was a complex room with this digrid sort of steel tubular structure and these. Yep. And so he was like, this is 100% a Bureau Happold project. So to his credit, he just walked over there and they gave us that scope of work. And
we'll take that.
yeah, and the building was like a toroid that had been like chopped at the
like
end.
Shunted, yes, at both ends.
Yeah,
right.
and the roof is like this section of a toroid, and they were creating that shape in Grasshopper, explicit history, Grasshopper, whatever it was at the time, and constantly updating that shape and everything else. Well, the structural engineers had to respond to that by like laying out the entire diagrid structure and then laying out these like ETFE capture channels that ran along the steel structure and making sure that all the capture channels were exactly normal to the surface to capture the ETFE cushions, and then the shape of these inflated ETFE cushions, all super complex. And I was like, let's do it in Revit. And of course, everybody's like, 100% no, we can't do this in Revit. It's like, but the thing was, at the end of the day, they needed the building model to be in Revit because they wanted to use Revit to do the drawings and stuff. So I was like, we can do it in Revit. And I come to learn after the fact, after we had finished this project, that HOK had actually taken that project to Autodesk and said, we really want to deliver this in Revit. Here it is, this like super complicated building with an ETFE roof and everything else. And can we do it in Revit? And Autodesk told them no. They were like, you're not going to be happy if you try and do this building in Revit.
That's pretty responsible of them to say that, actually.
Yeah, I think, well, every once in a while they have like a very reasonable like take. And at the time, like with this kind of geometry, like, yeah, 100% Revit was not the right tool for the job. But I've never let that stop me before. So
right.
This was where Dynamo really kind of started, was trying to figure out how I could recreate some of the geometry that the architect was doing in Grasshopper, at least enough layout geometry that I could then lay out the diagrid kind of structure, and then I could lay out the little things that stuck normal. And this is very much like the Moshe Safdie project. That's why I kind of looked at it and I squinted and I was like, it's like the Moshe Safdie project.
Yeah,
it was like vastly more complicated than the Moshe Safdie project. But we ended up doing it, and it ended up working. And to Revit's credit too, like the geometry APIs had gotten good enough at this point that you could do like, shapes like subtly twisting through space, and you could do all this kind of crazy stuff. So we did that project, and that was when Matt and I talked about, oh, okay, I'm being acquired by this other thing. I got to go open source this. So Stephen Elliott gets involved on this project, and he builds a library. So he builds a library of nodes. I don't think I had a library of nodes. I don't know how you got nodes into the graph. Like, there was like a search thing. Search was, so there was like you could only get nodes in the graph by searching.
Yep.
There was a little search bar. You'd have to know what they were called, but if you found them, you like press enter and it would drop it in your graph.
If you found them, right.
If you found it. There weren't that many, right? It's not like Dynamo now. It's like thousands of nodes.
But you're basically saying that the UI was a search field. I mean, it was like Google.
Yeah, because that was like the thing at the time. We were like, everything, the world's information is going to be indexed, and we're all.
Look where we've come back to. Like look at AI, right?
Dynamo is just going to be a chat interface at some point in the near future.
Let's take a quick break from the conversation to tell you about AVAIL. Is your team struggling to find the BIM assets they need? AVAIL's content management system simplifies access to all of your firm's content in one easy-to-use platform. No matter where your files live or what type of files they are, you can easily search and access them from AVAIL. Now, designers can consistently find and reuse all types of content. So what does that mean? Well, standards-compliant models and drawings are easier to create. The documentation process is less chaotic. New hires are easier to onboard. Projects are delivered faster with fewer errors. You get the idea. Visit getavail.com to try AVAIL for free and request a free demo. That's getavail.com, GETAVAIL.com. My thanks to AVAIL for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast. And now let's get back to the conversation.
So I think he built this library where he could drag and drop the nodes out, and then he proposed to completely rebuild the engine of Dynamo. It's not fair to say that the first version of Dynamo actually had an engine. It was event-based. It was For the programmers out there, it would mean that, you do something with this node, it would calculate something and it would trigger an event, and the downstream nodes would listen for that event, and they would take the data from that node and they would propagate that. They would do their calculation based on that data and send it downstream. The beautiful thing about the event-based system is that it was incredibly simple. Like, you could reason about it just by looking at the code, and then you could debug it. You could debug through a graph by just saying, like, okay, it does this. Where's that event received? Okay, it does this. You could check values and everything as a programmer, figure out what was going on. So when they came to me and they were like, we want to replace the Dynamo engine with this variant of scheme that Steven is working on, I was too young to really think about the implications of this. I was really too young to think, like, wow, it seems like it's going to be vastly more complicated than the thing that exists right now. But Steven was a really, really smart guy, and he was studying computer science, and I'd never studied computer science, and I was just like, okay, he must be smarter than me. So he goes off and he writes this engine based on Scheme. We can put it in the show notes what Scheme is, but it's a language. And also based on F#, which was a new language that Microsoft had started building, which was a functional programming language. And so he called this thing that he had built F-Scheme. And for a time, while we had this engine in Dynamo, you could actually print a Dynamo graph as a giant algebraic expression. I won't go into it here, but like this gets into Lisp and everything else. And you could literally like print, if you had 500 nodes in your graph, imagine printing that as like an embedded algebraic expression that was like a mile long. And that's kind of cool because in a way, like all the computation is like laid out right there for you. And it's super uncool because it's 100% unintelligible, and so at that moment in time, like, now with hindsight, Dynamo just got infinitely harder to interact with. Not like from a UI standpoint, but from a coding standpoint. So now we had to write, you were always like shoveling data into a form that the F-Scheme thing could process, and then you were popping that data back out of the F-Scheme form into a process that like the sort of managed.NET thing could process. And it was just super complicated, but it was kind of neat. And it still worked. It still worked really well. So like anybody who used Dynamo for the first couple of years that Autodesk was contributing to it was using it on this version of the engine. And then I think, that kind of planted the seed. Then people started to really use it. Like Autodesk was now contributing to this thing. And I will say, to their credit, Autodesk has allowed that project to be open source long after I've been involved with it. Like from day one, the Dynamo project was open source. And now it obviously has closed source components in the form of its geometry kernel and everything else. But even at the time, it was dependent on Revit for its geometry kernel. So like there was a very, very short window at the very beginning when it had its own geometry kernel, was like points and lines. And then it became Revit's geometry kernel. So that enabled a new kind of conversation with users. Like literally there was a shift. At that moment, there was a shift in how Autodesk talked to its customers. Prior to that, if you've been using an Autodesk product for a really long time, and this is not the fault of Autodesk, this is like all software at the time, there was some forum where you go and post a question.
Right.
And maybe somebody from the company would like respond to your forum post, and maybe it would get elevated to some place where it got into somebody's backlog and everything else. But Revit was like developing really quickly. It had this sprawling multi-year long backlog of stuff that they were going to work on. The chances of your thing, getting
noticed.
Even
noticed.
Yeah, let alone taken up, were very, very small. And it engendered this relationship between the software company and everybody else that was like, software company is going to do the thing that it does on its own schedule. You can ask for stuff, but it was like throwing darts at the side of a battleship or something, It's just like everything's just going to bounce off. And people felt, frustrated by that. Suddenly there's this little project that rides on top of one of those big projects that's going a mile a minute, and you can talk directly to the dev team. And you can like go to the open source repository and start putting issues in there and saying, oh, when I did this, this broke. And like a fix will be issued and a new installer will be built. And it's like the next day, that thing. And I think some of this vibe was also happening with Grasshopper at the time. You know, it was like just fixing super quickly, evolving really quickly. And that built that community. It built people who were like, wow, I really want to be part of this like new thing, engaging with this company in this new way. So that was fantastic. And just kind of feeling that and being at a moment and starting to see the first projects that people were doing with the thing. And I think at some point in here, adaptive components comes on the scene. And that became like a force multiplier because, Dynamo, up until then, there were families, which were kind of smart, but they couldn't really talk to each other. Like they could do smart things internally, but they couldn't talk to each other. And that was about it. And one thing that Dynamo solved really, really well was that it made families be able to talk to each other. So the value of this family when it changes over here could be piped into this other family. And now you could have these responsive kind of workflows. And you could even use stuff in your Revit family or in your Revit model as inputs, because Dynamo could respond. Like I could go change a parameter on this family over here. And if there was a Dynamo graph like piping values from that to some other place, when I change that parameter over here just manually in the Revit interface, the thing would magically update over here. So it was like action at a distance kind of thing. And adaptive components took that to the next level because now adaptive components were much smarter. You can embed much more smarts in them. They were much more flexible. So there's a year where every single Dynamo example that anybody made was basically like some crazy facade.
Right.
Because that's what Nate Miller had a fantastic, it was like the Revit splash, or it was the Dynamo splash screen at some point because it was this fantastic like stadium bowl roof that he took the geometry and turned it into points and made it an adaptive component for this like louver shade, and then made some Dynamo script that would not only lay those things out, but then change the value of the aperture, the size of the aperture based on very of the time.
Right.
Totally. And so Steven builds this new version of the engine, and then they brought on this guy full-time named Peter Boyer. Peter Boyer he's probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. Super, super smart guy, and also incredibly nice. He's one of the co-founders of Hierarch. So if you guys follow the startup scene, residential home building, the automation of residential home building, super cool startup. And Peter was the author of the package manager. So Peter, we were talking about this problem of people being able to sort of bottle up their Dynamo scripts and share them with one another. And Peter built basically by himself the first version of the Dynamo package manager. And a funny conversation around that was that I haven't been to Dynamo packages in so long. But like, wait, actually, I'm going to do this live because
do it live. Yeah.
Maybe this Dynamo packages. I think it's dynamopackages.com, if it's still there. Okay, right. So I remember it looks almost exactly like it did on day one when it came out. So that either means that nobody has wanted to work on this UI or that this UI just works incredibly well.
It was good enough. Yeah.
Dynamo Package Manager shows you like how many people have installed something. And it shows you the most active packages, and it shows you the most popular packages and everything else. But there's that one number at the top that is the number of installs. And I remember Peter had made it, it only had like 3 digits or 5 digits or something. And I was like, give it more digits, give it more space. Because at some point, like imagine when this is 1 million, right. And he looked at me like, right, like 1 million Dynamo packages, like, or 1 million installs, like when's that gonna be? So right now it's 6.9 million installs. And the way that I always talk about that number is like, that means in 6.9 million instances, somebody chose to use something that was built by somebody else rather than rebuild it themselves.
Nice.
You know, like if there's one legacy to leave, you know, I hope what that represents is like some time savings. I hope it represents people getting home to hang out with their families at 5 p.m. instead of 10 p.m.
I think it also represents this idea of like making, like the craft of architecture and actually tinkering with things. You know, I kind of think of it like you're in a workshop, except it's at a computer, right? And you're actually tinkering with stuff, and you're opening the hood and you're looking underneath and you're doing those things and you're learning by doing that. And to me, like how many neurons have you fired off with 6.9 million installs? It's just got to be like logarithmic compared to that number, right?
I think that to your point, I think architects are fundamentally tool makers. And there's a very rich history of that right up until we start doing everything in the computer. There's even a future right when we start using computers of like imagining what we were going to do vis-a-vis building tools and using the power of computation. And that future is still totally unrecognized. You know, like we're doing the most surface level kind of thing with these supercomputers that we have, which is basically use them as like a digital version of a drafting board. There's a whole other, maybe our third conversation, Evan, which is like why Hyper exists, which is to solve this problem. But it's like we don't use computation to design buildings right now. We use humans to design buildings. We use computation to just turn that stuff into bits, you know, so we can represent it ultimately as drawings.
Abstract it, right?
Yeah.
Let's take a short break from the conversation to invite you to join the most influential technology leaders in the AEC industry at Confluence. Composed of in-person events and a podcast co-hosted by yours truly, Confluence is designed to foster conversations between AEC firms and technology companies so they can learn, share, and engage with each other to support industry innovation. Software company AVAIL, which creates content management solutions for the AEC industry, started hosting Confluence events in 2019 to understand what firms are needing, wanting, and thinking around technology. To learn more about Confluence, explore upcoming events, and listen to podcast episodes, go to confluence.getavail.com. My thanks to Confluence for supporting this episode of the Troxel Podcast. And now, let's get back to the conversation. It makes me think of Steve Jobs saying, you know, like the computer is a bicycle for the mind, right? Because that was all based on this idea of this graph where it talked about different animals and their speed, right? And man was like way down here in the corner and the cheetah was up into the right? And then there was a human with a bicycle, which was like this outlier, you know, edge condition that just was like incredible. And so like the story that he put to that was the computer's the bicycle for the mind. Back to your point, like what can you do with this tool and what is possible? It is absolutely incredible, the potential there.
And he was imagining the force multiplier of like, you know, if you go back to the time when he was giving that speech, he was thinking about like VisiCalc, you know, the very early spreadsheet software. He was thinking like, my God, you know how long it takes to, like, can people even do these kind of computations? Yes, they do them all by hand or with a calculator and this big like tables of stuff. Like the force multiplier was 100x for the person who was doing that, maybe 1,000x. I don't think we've ever achieved that with our digital tools. You could argue that there's buildings that we can build now that we just simply didn't build before because we can represent them now. But in terms of the actual mechanical act of like producing a building, I don't know that we've had 100x.
Right. I mean, you look at, there's like a meme out there, right? It's like a dude with a pencil and then like all this computation and digital everything technology. And it's like Sagrada Familia and the transportation hub in Anaheim, right? Like whatever those two examples are, but it's like those aren't 100x. That it's not even 10x.
Yeah. And even for day-to-day buildings, right? The 99.9% of all the buildings that we will ever inhabit, you know, which are the sort of run-of-the-mill, what Daniel Davis calls the fat middle of buildings, right? Like, why are we not just like generating those? Why are people still manually moving stuff around on a screen? So you can consider, I'll pin the Hyper discussion, but like you can consider Dynamo as like a step on a trajectory that's pointing toward what we're eventually doing at Hypar. But a lot of that started with also this idea of like the package manager and people being able to bottle up the code that they were working on and share it with each other. And at this point, I think we were also still just aping a lot of what was happening in the nascent sort of Grasshopper community. It was now fully Grasshopper. They didn't have a package manager, but they had Food for Rhino or whatever it was called back in the day. And we saw that. Yeah. We're like, people definitely have to be able to do this on Dynamo. So then there's some period where I get acquired. The company that I'm at gets acquired into Autodesk. And that was Vela Systems, and Vela's product would go on to become BIM 360 Field. So I worked a full year and a half probably inside Autodesk on a totally different project, like not involving Dynamo at all. And it was like AU 2 years into my time at Autodesk. I don't even know when that would have been, 2013, 2014. I don't know. A couple years into my time at Autodesk, this guy comes barreling towards me. And I'm still going to AU, and I'm like sitting in the back of the Dynamo classrooms as Matt Jezik and Zach Krohn present Dynamo.
Right.
And those were the first classes that like suddenly, like, so the first year they did it, they had, I think one of the classes was called Energetic Supermodels with Dynamo or something. Had this kind of like tongue-in-cheek sort of thing. And I think Zach and Matt led that class, and there was like one classroom full of Dynamo stuff, like a smallish classroom. And I sat in the very, very back, and I was just like, oh man, this thing's going to crash. It's like not ready for this. Matt had asked.
Live demos, really, guys?
Yeah, Matt had asked, he's like, can we lead a thing in AU on this? And I happened to be going to AU because now I think I was in Autodesk at that point, or like maybe I was going to, no, actually that first one, I was still going to AU for this other company, for Vela Systems, because we were presenting Vela, and I was working Vela's booth.
You were just going to catch up on what they had been working on Dynamo, so you could actually see it. and I'm like in the back of the room, just like, oh my God, this is really bad. There were maybe 30 people in the room, and I'm thinking, oh my God. So that was the first class, and then the second year, I remember, they had like a line to get into the classroom. And I was like, why is there a line to get it? Have they not opened the door yet or something? But there was a line to get in the classroom to learn about this thing called Dynamo that people largely like still didn't know of. But there was like at least a classroom plus a little bit of overflow worth of people who like had heard about this thing and were like, they were members of that community. And they were all adopters,
like, freaking out on like, I'm gonna be the first person in my area who knows how to do this, and it's gonna increase my value to my firm, and I'm gonna be part of this community. So that's when you kind of get this sense that it's like an exciting thing. So at that AU, I think this guy comes barreling towards me, and he's like, starts talking a mile a minute about Dynamo and how incredible it's gonna be, and what we're gonna do, and we're gonna build this, and we're gonna have a team, and we're gonna do this, and I'm just like, the guy talks for like 3 minutes, like without taking a breath. And I'm like, I'm sorry, who are you? And it turns out it's this guy, Abhijit Oak. Abhijit had been an AutoCAD guy inside Autodesk for a long time. And then he was put in charge of the Dynamo team. I can't remember what the org structure of Autodesk looked at the time. It was always changing, but like Abhijit was somehow put in charge of Dynamo. And so he was like really excited about this. And he found me, and he comes charging at me, telling me all these things we're going to do. And I'm like, oh, okay. But I'm not on like the Dynamo team, right? I'm working on BIM 360 Field in the construction thing. And he's like, yeah, you're going to be on the Dynamo team.
Let's fix that.
Like, what is the Dynamo team? And he's like, oh, we're going to make a team. So they make a team. They make it's like Peter Boyer and maybe Stephen Elliott was still there for a little while. And it's Zach Krohn is kind of coming over from the Revit team, and myself. And Matt Jezik was kind of peripheral to it, but like he was kind of shepherding this thing along. But I don't think he was ever like a full-time member of that team. And then they started pulling in this guy, like actual Revit developers who had gotten fed up with developing Revit. They were like, hey, I want to go work on that Dynamo thing. Because like Dynamo was now like the cool. Revit at that point was kind of just like what it was and what it was going to be.
They were looking for a reason to want to go to work the next day.
And so, I mean, there's a whole other podcast about this guy, Lev Lipkin, who is incredible. Lev was like an original Revit developer, super, super smart guy. I mean, just a brilliant guy. He came over and we were dreaming up all kinds of crazy stuff. Like at one point, we were going to embed the Dynamo runtime inside families so that families could have their own onboard computational logic, you know? And it was super cool. Like imagine like, you know, instead of just family logic, like you could put any kind of Dynamo logic inside a family. And then you could also on top of that use Dynamo to like automate those families, like talk to me. It was crazy. So we built this team around it then it was becoming like a corporate kind of thing. Now it was like, okay, this is an Autodesk project. And you know, at some points I had to work to make sure that they understood that it was still open source. Like there was still enough, open source was still unfamiliar enough that people inside Autodesk didn't like get the idea that Autodesk was contributing to this open source project. In other words, like they didn't own it. Mm-hmm. That was confusing to them.
Sure.
So Matt Jessic,
is that the only thing like that in Autodesk at that time?
Probably. I don't know for sure, but it's certainly like it was certainly the only one that I knew of. Yeah. You know, and so Matt was always like having to defend the open source thing and talk about how like it was a different way of engaging with customers, and that's why it was like going in this way. And I think he also, although he never said this to me, but I think he also like he was much more connected to the higher levels of Autodesk. I think he also sold up the idea that like this thing was valuable to Revit. It was there to sell more Revit.
Yeah.
It could help them sell more Revit, you know, because that was really the thing that they were concerned about. Autodesk wants to sell you more Revit, and so having this thing that could be somewhat of a flywheel for that, even though it was like a small thing at the beginning.
Part of the funnel, ultimately, right? And you're talking about the thing that people are excited about using to alongside Revit or on top of Revit. I mean, you have to capitalize on that excitement, right?
Yeah, and so one unfortunate consequence of that, and I say all this with a big asterisk because I have a very soft spot in my heart for Autodesk. I worked there for a number of years. I have a lot of great friends who worked at Autodesk. So that's the big caveat to a lot of what I'm going to say. Autodesk sometimes has this mentality of like, we're going to go into the market and make a product that feature for feature like competes, and we're going to win because we own the channel or whatever. You know, you saw this with things like Format and SketchUp. They were like, we're going to kill SketchUp. Let's make something that does all the things that SketchUp does. And they actually made a beautiful product. And I know the team who worked on it was kind of brilliant in many ways. But like, I don't know, it's a troubling thing to try and compete like that. You know, instead of like really differentiating on some other vector of value, you just say like, we're going to do exactly the same thing that you do, but because we do it, you know, anybody who uses Teams, Microsoft Teams, understands what this feels like in a product. Meh. You know, like you build a product.
Mediocre. Yeah.
You know, but it's just like, meh. And so one of the things that they tried to do, I think, maybe they're still trying to do it, is like they were looking at Grasshopper and they were like, this has to be Grasshopper.
I was going to ask you, like, where did that excitement internally come from? I mean, maybe it's a combination of things, right? But the excitement from the user base and the raw potential of this layer sitting on top of Revit and the way that it can now interact with other packages or platforms. Maybe they didn't care about that at all. Like, I know Autodesk really likes to focus on themselves and what you can build inside their tools. But then also there are these competing pressures in the industry, a la Grasshopper, right? And so I was just wondering if you had, I'm sure you have thoughts, but that's kind of where you're going.
Two things. One, it turned a $4,000 software, whatever it cost at the time, into a $20,000 piece of software. Honestly, to this day,
value-wise, yeah.
Value-wise, Like I've worked with digital projects. I worked with Keough. They're incredible. This thing gave Revit capabilities that it couldn't do. And in the way that it was implemented, just, I guess by chance, managed to up-level Revit. And that was not only just like the geometry stuff, the adaptive components, all the stuff I've talked about. It was actually much more of the like mundane day-to-day stuff. Like people don't remember that back in the day, if you were working on a project that was 30 stories tall and you were like, oh, we put a mechanical level in here. Now we got to rename all our levels. Like you had to manually go and rename like 30. So a lot of the early years of Dynamo was like people automating sheet numbering, level renaming, just this really, but tag placement, like scripts for placing tags on pages in certain ways and stuff, like really, really run-of-the-mill kind of stuff. And they were doing it themselves. And that was the critical thing. Like they weren't waiting for Autodesk or waiting for some other script provider or whatever. So like that's that kind of motion that when you see that happening, you're like, oh, wow, this thing could take off. Because now you've turned every one of your users, not every one of your users, let's say of all the people using Revit at the time, let's say there were 10%, 20% at a maximum that would be Dynamo users. Well, I don't know how many people that is. It's a fair number, though. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. At the time, it was probably 100,000 people who are now developers building tools on top of your software. That's an incredible force multiplier.
Totally. Yep.
That's one. And number two, which is a little bit less nice, is that, you know, when you're a publicly traded company, you need to represent that the products that you're putting into the market are continuing to deliver value if you are going to raise the price. And when you have an ecosystem like the one that Dynamo provided, creating more value in the ecosystem of people, you know, working on Revit, you could represent that Revit was worth more. Because you weren't selling Dynamo. Dynamo was free. You were selling Revit. And on top of it was this thing that like added all this extra value. And the value in that thing was growing all the time. It's still growing to this day. You know? So you could represent that you could actually charge more for Revit because this community was building all this extra stuff that...
It's crazy, right? Because you also have these people building tools that are show up in the package manager, right? That are adding value to that ecosystem and not getting compensated for it, right? So like that's crazy, right?
we had lots of discussions going back to the beginning of Dynamo when Autodesk first started contributing to it. Like, could we get these people paid? Like, could the people
create a marketplace or something?
Nate Miller, whose tools have been on Dynamo since basically the package manager existed and might still be on the front page of the package manager as one of the most popular tool sets over all time, has never gained a cent from any of that stuff. And I think Nate should be a millionaire. Like if he got a penny for every time somebody downloaded, or a nickel for every time somebody downloaded his package, like.
Or Conrad, or John Pearson, or like there's many. There's
absolutely.
Many,
And so that's always been one of the vexing things about like that motion. Yeah, we had all these people and they contributed all this stuff, and it never changed the way that value flows through AEC. Like everybody's still compensated in the same way for their hours. This yet again dovetails into what HypeR is trying to do. But so the last big part of the story of Dynamo is when we mashed it together with DesignScript. So you remember that I was working on generative components at the very beginning of my career. Right. Generative components was made by this brilliant guy named Robert Aish. And some of your older users, your listeners will remember Robert Aish. Robert Aish was the father of generative components, which was another plugin like Dynamo, like Grasshopper, but it ran on top of Bentley MicroStation,
right?
Or Triforma MicroStation, I think. It ran on top of
MicroStation, I believe, yeah.
And the Smart Geometry Conference, at least in the very early days, was a generative components conference. It was the conference where Robert Aish would run around with like a USB key on a lanyard around his neck that had the latest build on it. and he would like plug it into your computer and give you the new bits.
Give me the juice.
Literally,
Man.
he was sitting in the corner like fixing problems with generative components in real time.
Wow.
So a lot of us have Robert Aish to thank for a lot of this stuff. But one of the things that Robert had done, at some point, Autodesk convinced him to come over to Autodesk. I can't remember where he was, but like they were like, you got to come to Autodesk, and we'll allow you to work on all these projects that you're interested in and everything else. Well, Robert, since generative components, you should probably get Robert on the show. Since generative components had this idea for DesignScript, which was a language, a textual programming language that had affordances in it for the kinds of programming that architects need to do a lot of. Like, I've got a facade, it's made up of all of these panels. Those panels generally look like an array in programming terminology. I want to index into like this row, this panel, this mullion on that panel, and do this specific thing. And so the DesignScript language, which is still the language that's in code blocks in Dynamo, it had these things called replication guides that allowed you to do all that stuff. So it was pretty cool, and it was also this associative language, so it had forward and backwards associativity, which I won't go into here, but if you've seen like very early demos of DesignScript, it was like kind of mind-bendy when you watched it work. You were like, how would that work? And so Robert was inside Autodesk working on this DesignScript project, and he had this team in Singapore dedicated to him building the DesignScript interpreter, the DesignScript virtual machine. A virtual machine is like the brain that runs this language gets compiled into a code that the virtual machine can read and run. It runs that code. And a DesignScript environment, because Robert started going around and telling people about DesignScript. And they'd be like, yeah, you know what this really needs? A visual programming interface. And he hated that because he was like designing this programming language that was going to be so easy to use and have all these affordances for architects. And every single person who had now seen Grasshopper, who had now seen Dynamo, they were like, yeah, you need to put an interface on this thing. So he had this team in Singapore start building an interface for it, and they called it the DesignScript Studio. And there was this guy, Luke Church, who might still be at Google today. He was put in charge of building the DesignScript Studio. Luke was another really, really interesting and smart guy. And DesignScript Studio was very pretty. It was like you could nodes and wires, and then you could get like previews. When you hovered over a node, you could get a preview of like the compute at that exact moment. You get this like little visual preview of what was flowing through the system at that point. So they did all these like kind of clever things. But now Autodesk has two projects, DesignScript and Dynamo, which are basically doing the same thing. And Dynamo was further ahead in its visual programming language, and it interfaced very deeply with Revit, because that was the other thing that people asked for. They were like, this needs a visual programming interface, and it also needs to talk to Revit. So Abhijit, who was the guy who oversaw both of these projects, was like, we're going to bring these projects together. And he told us this, he told the Dynamo team this, and we were like, no. We're like, what do we need that for? And you know, I was just kind of like, oh man, like I had gone through the whole like F scheme thing with Stephen Elliott, and I was like, I really don't want to make like another, because I knew this was going to turn into some like big architectural, software architectural like thing that we would need to do. And so I kind of rejected it at first, and I think Matt and Zach probably calmed me down and were like, look, we kind of got to do this. It doesn't make any sense that Autodesk has these two visual programming languages that are being developed by two teams trying to like, beat each other or something. So we started to sketch out like how this would even work. And the core piece of that was to use the DesignScript virtual machine as the engine. So we were going to rip out the stuff that Stephen Elliott had done and make a third version of the Dynamo engine based on the DesignScript virtual machine. And that would give us a couple of really cool things. One thing that the DesignScript virtual machine did was it ran on DesignScript, the language. So we could have programming interfaces in nodes inside Hyper that you could type design script into,
Dynamo.
and it would execute on it.
You said Hyper.
Oh, did I say Hyper? Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, there's no design script in Hyper. Inside Dynamo. So that was cool because then you could use replication guides and all the stuff. And if you really were into design script, you could do that. And the second cool thing is they had built an interface called Zero Touch. Zero Touch enabled them to take any .NET managed class library. I'm going to say technical stuff, but like a library full of like methods and functions and stuff, and emit. You could drop that onto design script, and it would it could read all of the public methods and essentially create nodes for you that expose those things. So people who use Dynamo to this day still understand the concept of zero-touch nodes. You can literally like grab an off-the-shelf like C# library from someplace and drop it on Dynamo, and provided that it has public methods with certain types of signatures, it will just show up as nodes. I actually don't know if this is still true because I haven't played with Dynamo in a while, but that was the idea. And it made development of external libraries for creating nodes really, really easy and straightforward. So that was cool too. But what wasn't cool about it was that we now owned a programming language. Like, I have subsequently learned a lot about programming languages, programming language implementations, how to make virtual machines, compilers, all this stuff that I never ever thought when I went to art school I would ever have to learn about. But I had to learn about because of like design script and getting like very, very deeply into there. But the problem is when you make a core technology like that is so arcane, you kind of put a hard shell around it. Mm-hmm. And now it's very hard for other developers to get in there and change things, adapt things. You know, the story that kind of, and I don't know if it's actually true, but they say about like the core of Excel, they've tried over the years to like touch that thing and edit it to do other stuff, and it's blown up on Microsoft, and they've just like backed away. And so there's like still a core in Excel that like was written by some of the original developers, and like new developers just kind of like work outside of that shell. And that's kind of what the design script virtual machine is like. There's like inside.
Well, it kind of reminds me of your story about Burrow Happold, right? Where it's like what happened with the Dynamo library, and it's like like it's too hard to maintain. Like we couldn't even like, I mean, this maybe is still being used, but it's the same kind of a thing where it's just like, well, we couldn't figure out how to get in there and what to do with it, so we don't touch it.
Software people do the same thing to each other. You know, it's not just like we know how, like any software, any like developer can get in and mess with any kind of code. And there's two pieces of code inside Dynamo that basically function like that. There's the design script virtual machine, and there's the geometry library. The geometry library is now the geometry library that sits at the heart of a bunch of Autodesk products. And that was another big part of this upgrade, was we were going to switch off the Revit geometry library and go to ASM. ASM is the Autodesk geometry library. And it gave us all kinds of like really sweet geometry that we couldn't make before because Revit just couldn't make that kind of geometry. And it has cross-compatibility with Revit. So these things, the geometry library was definitely beneficial, but that's also another one of these things that like very few people get down inside that thing and muck around with it, because like geometry libraries there's like a whole team of PhDs at like Oxford or somebody that work for Autodesk who that's all they do is like work on the geometry kernels, right? And so you had these pieces now that were like central to the architecture of Dynamo that the core team, there were like one person per that could like work on this stuff. So it caused a little bit of, a challenge, but we brought this thing out. There was a period of instability, which people will remember, like yellow nodes with Band-Aids on them and stuff, or yellow warning messages with Band-Aids on them and little cartoon drawings of, because things were breaking all the time. Like we'd made all these giant architectural changes. And people were really kind of pissed, like, because we were breaking their workflows. There was like stuff that just wasn't backwards compatible. Geometry libraries were different. So geometry didn't work quite the same way. But, to Autodesk's credit, they weren't backing down. Like they were like, the only way out is through. Like, we're going to get this. And we just like over 6 months or something, we just like worked down like all of these things until we got to a place where we were relatively stable, and back in a place where this thing was, part of people's production kind of workflows. And that was the last big transition, and that happened probably 2 years before I left. And then at some point, I transitioned off the Dynamo team to go work with Anthony, my co-founder at Hypar, to go work with Anthony on a Dynamo-based project, which was called Fractal, but which would go on to become Autodesk Generative Design, which I think still exists, and you can use it on top of Revit, to use Dynamo scripts basically as the language to make modules to run in that thing. So honestly, I mean, that was 20... I probably haven't been involved with the Dynamo project since about 2017, maybe 2017. So take everything I say here, listener, with a huge grain of salt, because that team has worked incredibly hard since then and have maintained that community and probably grown that community.
Right.
I knew like a few years after I even left Autodesk, I knew that this thing had reached a different level when I started to see job postings that had Dynamo in them. It's like, what? Like, like by name, like a software that you worked on, like is like a nice to have for somebody who's getting a job at an architecture firm. That seems insane to me.
Yeah. And then after that, like you search Dynamo. I mean, it was like 2016, maybe 2015, probably 2016. AU, right? Autodesk University. You search for any course with Dynamo that you could find in the title, and they were all full. Every single one of them.
That was the other thing.
All the labs, all the courses. Yep.
Yeah, I couldn't. I remember Zach laughed at me one time because so one other funny story about Zach is that he makes his own moonshine. Zach Crone, the product manager of
a listener of this podcast,
who is incredible. He makes his own moonshine. He grows all his own grapes like on these trellises around his house, and then he makes, I don't know if it's fair to call it moonshine. It's this very clear, very strong liquor. And he brings it to Autodesk University in these mason jars. And we would sit in the back of these Dynamo workshops, which at one point were no longer run by Autodesk people. Like, this was the community, straight up. Right. John Pearson, guys like that, like running these classes. And he'd pour us cups of this like crazy alcohol. And we'd sit back there and just like toast to the success of Dynamo. And he laughed at me one time. He was like, I couldn't get into one of the classes. So I went outside, like it was so packed and there was an overflow line. And I went outside and stood at the back of this overflow line. And at some point, somebody who was in front of me in the overflow line, like turned around and was like, shouldn't you be in there? I was like, I didn't sign up for the class. I can't go in. I think I eventually made it in, but like, yeah, now it's like, it's crazy. Like the number of Dynamo classes and like, and I will say that, I mean, one of the most gratifying things, there's really two gratifying things that I still hear to this day. It's like, when I talk to people about their Dynamo experience, they'll say things like, Dynamo completely changed my career. Like it enabled me to do things and level up and provide value to my organization that I wouldn't have been able to do without it. And like that it put me on a different trajectory. Like the whole thing about, I'm not going to attribute this all to Dynamo. There's been a lot of motion in computational design over the last couple of years, but like the whole thing that there are computational designers now, that's Grasshopper at work. That's Dynamo at work. The fact that that's a title, there were no computational designers before Grasshopper and Dynamo and everything else. So that's like a new class so that's really incredible to hear. I still think there's a lot of work to be done there to change things. But, and the second one is people will tell me that Dynamo is how they learned how to program a computer, which blows my mind because, and in a way, like, they did it because they started with Dynamo visual programming, and then they got really frustrated that their graphs were like so big and messy spaghetti. So they would start programming in code blocks, and they probably start with design script, And then they were like, but there's all these like really cool, Mustafa makes this really cool like Python library that I can connect in. So I'm going to use a Python node instead. So they put a Python node in there. Then they start reading up on like how to program in Python. And over time, more and more of their code, their visual program started to disappear inside these Python nodes. And then at some point they were like, I want to go like as fast as I can possibly go. I'm going to write my own C# library that I import as a zero-touch node. And then once they've done that, they're like, well, I want to build my own like standalone software now. And so they like, or I want to build my own Revit plugin that just does this one specific thing. So the thing started as like a Dynamo graph and evolved into its own standalone kind of thing. And the person who worked on that went from knowing nothing about programming to like programming.
Yeah.
And
you employ people. You employ people literally who have been on that journey right there.
Yeah. Yeah, like Hypar is a lot of architects. Like there's a lot of people. Andrew Human, who's on my team, is like the
I was directly thinking of Andrew. Yep.
He is beyond in terms of examples of this. A lot of people look at Andrew and they're like, I want to be that guy because he didn't start knowing how to program anything. Right. He did. Now his trajectory went through Grasshopper,
right?
In the Grasshopper community, but I think very much the same thing. And now he's like our lead developer. So
incredible story. Thank you so much for taking the time to tell it, and to tell it here. You never have to tell this story again.
I'm looking at the time now, and I'm recognizing how long it took to tell, and maybe that's why I've never told the whole thing from start to end, because you never have enough time at the bar, to tell that story.
Well, I truly appreciate it, and I think the listeners will enjoy it very much, so they appreciate it as well. So thanks, Ian.
I appreciate the opportunity, Evan. Always a pleasure to chat.
Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to our members this week. Find out how you can become a member at trxl.co, and I'll talk to you again next week.